Right. Okay. So yeah, I'm Laz. I'm an Agile coach at Skyscanner, and I'm going to talk to you this evening for a little bit about theory of constraints. I'm well aware that I am between you, the exit door, the pub, or the baby that's at home, or whatever it is. So I'll try and keep it brief. That said, I am talking about one man's life work, so I'm going to try and compress it into 15 minutes or so. So I've been trying to study theory of constraints for the last couple of years. It's something we use a lot at Skyscanner. Our Chief Operating Officer, Mark Logan, read the first book on his way back from office in Singapore a while back, and since then we've been using it over and over again. It's a bunch of tools, but it's quite hard to get your head around, so it's something I'd like to share. So we've had some really big successes with it at Skyscanner. We've taken some teams who've had sort of a near traffic jam of stuff going through them to being a free-flowing sort of example to everybody else. We've had some other teams where we've seen their productivity go sort of up by sort of 2, 3, 4 times. And more recently, we've actually been using it to address some really big systemic issues across the organization, which is where it really comes into its own. So I'm not going to talk about all of that, but I'm going to give you some hints, some appetizers to some of this stuff. And there's some references at the end as to where to go, some of the things I've been looking at, some of my go-tos over the last couple of years, where you can read more if you're interested. But I will give you some takeaways that you can take away and do something with tomorrow, next week, or whenever the opportunity arises. So it's the work of this man, Eli Goldratt, who published his first book in 1984, passed away about 5 years ago, with still a pile of books still left to publish. There's a bunch of stuff we'll never know that he was going to talk about. But he started off in 1984 talking about the goal, and this was really about manufacturing. So this is one of the first issues we have with the theory of constraints, is that a lot of the source material isn't actually in our context. It isn't in the context of software development. And that's because it's got a really wide application. It's been applied in manufacturing, it's been applied in healthcare, but it's got really deep applications in the software industry as well. So it's really worth trying to get your head around if you've got a little bit of time. I'd like to try and give you some shortcuts to that today. So one thing Goldratt never gave us was a nice picture that sort of described what the whole thing was, so we can get our heads around it. Something we've all become quite familiar with. This was well before the days of infographics, so we don't have like a Scrum sort of similar thing where we can see exactly how the whole thing works. We don't have that. Goldratt was a big believer in the Socratic method, which effectively means learning by doing. So all of his books are written as novels. You are taken on a journey of the main character as you explore the problem, explore him exploring the solutions, and then finding out how these things work and seeing the successes, which is a really valuable way to learn about something. But in terms of trying to then take it and move it into a different domain, that can make it quite challenging. So he never actually wrote that textbook. There's other people who've written quite large textbooks on it as well, but he never did that. That said, the other thing is it can be a tendency for big bang thinking with some of the theory of constraint stuff. When it says some of the stuff is called the thinking processes, and when he talks about the thinking processes, he isn't kidding. You have to put quite a lot of logic and quite a lot of concentration into this, and for some of that stuff, that might feel like you have to go to big bang, and you don't have to. You don't have to do that. So at Skyscanner, we worked out some quick wins, and these are covered in other places, and a lot of these won't be surprising. So if you're not doing these things, before you try any of the other theory of constraint stuff, start doing this stuff first. Because if you don't start doing this stuff first, you'll do theory of constraints, you'll work through the problems, and then you'll find you end up here anyway. So it makes sense just to start doing this stuff first. I put prioritizing on there because it would be obvious by its absence if it wasn't on there, but I'm not going to explain it because it's obvious to this group, right? Good. Things like squads, at Skyscanner we have squads, not teams. Some of you might have heard about that. It's a thing. So squads being able to deliver value independently. If you do that, you don't have the waterfall effect, and people are able to really get on and deliver value. So you shortcut all of that. If you build quality in, it doesn't matter where your bottleneck is, where your constraint is in the process. You have less waste going through that constraint wherever it is. I'm really glad you mentioned value stream mapping earlier on, because I'm not going to talk about that, but that's a real central part of theory of constraints. if you do these two things, if you work in small slices, small batches, and limit your work in progress, then you just become more agile. You have much, much lower lead times. You're able to pivot much more easily. You have less wastage because as you find out things are wrong, you don't have to bin a whole big batch's worth of stuff. You just have to bin the small batch you're working on now. So all of that stuff theory of constraints gives us, but you don't have to work it out yourself because it's already kind of proven stuff. So when we're going on to the rest of theory of constraints, there are some core principles that we really need to understand. So the first is systems. So when he talks about looking at how we improve things, what we need to do is look at the whole system, the whole flow from soup to nuts, from the beginning of an idea, from an idea starting, all the way through to that value being delivered to a customer, or even better, us validating that idea actually works for customers. If you don't do that, then you'll end up optimizing for that small part of the process you are looking at. So if you try and optimize for the development process, then you'll get development going really well, but you won't actually move anything any faster if the constraint's somewhere else. Yeah? You might even make it worse. So before you start doing any theory of constraint stuff, you need to have the capability of looking at the whole system. You don't have to look at the whole organization. You can do a narrow, one team if they're going soup to nuts, or if you can do one collection of teams if they're going soup to nuts and not worry about everybody else, as long as you don't impact outside of that band. Because if you do that, then you may start sub-optimizing everything else. The next thing is the goal. And this is, again, from an Agile community point, this thing is really obvious, right? Make sure that when you're making changes, make sure when you're thinking about what's not working, that you're thinking about what does the organization actually need? What is the impact we're actually trying to have? And this is important because if you don't know what your goal is, if you don't know what your outcome is, then you're not actually going, it's impossible to optimize for it. Okay? And Goldratt gives us some measures for that. And Marsden touched on this when you were talking about value earlier on. You talk about cost, and you asked a question about what do we use, what metric do we use, and it's probably money. In most organizations, it is making money. In other organizations, some organizations it can be a different thing. But you've got to know what that goal is and how you're measuring for it. Yeah. And the last thing is focus, and this is really what I like to think of as the theory of constraints. If somebody asks you in 2 words what the theory of constraints is, it's focus. It's the Goldratt's theory, hypothesis, assertion that there's at any one point in time there's a very small, if not single thing that's holding a whole organizational system back. So if you're not fixing that thing, if you're not fixing that constraint, everything you do may well have no effect at all because you're not addressing the thing that's actually holding the organization back. There'll be one thing that's the slowest part of the system or has the lowest capacity, and if you're not focusing on that, what you do might not have any effect at all. So that's when I think about someone says the theory of constraints, that's the key assertion in the middle of the whole thing, that we've got to have that focus on what is it. So the next thing is, how do you find it? How do you find this thing to focus on? And this is where the books come in. There's a whole bunch of different tools and processes to use to find this thing in different circumstances. And at Skyscanner, we use a few different tools in a few different contexts. And this is our toolbox. So they're context specific. There's all the flow management stuff. And if anybody who's read the goal here, I probably should check who's read the goal. Cool. So the second half of the goal talks about flow management. Yeah, that's all that, when people think about theory of constraints, that's usually what you've talked about. I'm not going to talk about that today because if you have read the goal, if you have thought about theory of constraints, that's what you know about. So we use that. We use these things called current reality trees. Has anyone done a 5 whys exercise in a retrospective? Yeah? So these are like 5 whys exercises on steroids, right? Because they accept multiple things going wrong at the top, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this. Multiple things going wrong at the top that we care about that are actually impacting our goal. And then we work all the way down to find the thing at the bottom, the thing or the small number of things that are having an effect at the bottom. And there's a way that this works. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. But once I started to learn how these worked, it made me doubt a lot of the retrospective techniques that I've been using for the last 10 years, because a lot of them don't actually get down to this. A lot of them don't validate that the thing we're going to fix is actually the root cause of the problem of us not achieving our objectives. So it really made me think about that. The next thing we use, and I'm going to go into some detail on these because they're a bit simpler, is evaporating clouds. And these are really cool for dissecting dilemmas. Yeah? When you've got a choice between two things, but those two things are mutually exclusive. We've used those things quite a lot. There's a whole pile of other thinking processes, and they're all really to do with change management. And unless you're working at a really high level in the organization, a lot of this is where the big bang stuff comes in. There's a tendency, there's a lot of stuff here that you could do. And actually, in an agile organization, sometimes it's easier just to use a couple of these and then try it out and see if it works. Yeah? As long as you try it out in a safe-to-fail kind of way, that's OK. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about evaporating clouds, because these are things you can actually use. So this is an evaporating cloud. It's got 5 bits. And the bits are there's two wants, there's 2 needs, and there's an objective. And this is a simple way of expressing a dilemma, right? In this case, I want to have my cake and I want to eat it. Those are the 2 wants. I can't do those 2 things. They're mutually exclusive. There are 2 needs. I want to enjoy my cake today and enjoy my cake tomorrow. That's fine. Those 2 needs are not mutually exclusive. But if I have to have these 2 wants, that doesn't work. And there's an objective that brings the whole thing together. And that objective is really important because when you've got 2 groups of people, say you've got the eat my cake camp in your department, and you've got the have my cake camp. As soon as you draw this diagram, they're suddenly united about a single objective that they're both trying to work towards. And suddenly, it becomes the whole group of people, both sides of that, both camps, trying to solve this problem so they can achieve that objective, rather than the eat my cake camp trying to beat the have my cake camp. I'm going to talk about a personal example, just to make it a bit more real. So this is one I drew with my parents about 1.5 years ago. They were trying to decide whether they both reached retirement age, whether they should move to the seaside or stay in London. This had been going on for quite a long time. When I was 16, we almost moved to the seaside, and we didn't. I can't quite remember why. And they got to retirement age, and it was coming up again, and it would be going on for years. So eventually, last summer, I sat them down, and we eventually drew this diagram. So the 2 wants, we want to stay in London, and we want to move to the seaside. Okay, those things are obviously mutually exclusive. You can't do that without some kind of sort of fancy transporter device. And then we worked out the rest. This bit was easy. They had this dream of living by the seaside. They holidayed by the seaside for quite a long time, and they wanted that to be happy. And stay in London, this took a while to find what this was, why they really wanted to stay in London. And eventually it came down to that. And then to evaporate the cloud. Then what you do is you question each of the arrows. Each of the arrows represents at least one assumption. So you ask the question, in order to be happy, do we need to have our seaside dream? So I let them have that, because you can't really, that one's difficult to question. So we said that was a yes. In order to have a seaside dream, we need to live by the seaside. Duh. Okay, in order to be happy, we want to see our friends often. That makes sense. We're all human beings. We all like company. We all like the company of people we know and familiar with. That makes sense. In order to see our friends, we need to stay in London. And then they realized that if this was the only reason they wanted to stay in London, their friends had been going on holiday with them to the seaside for quite a long time. The seaside is quite close to London. The place they were going to move to have really good train links. And at that point, the cloud evaporated, and I left them. And 6 weeks later, the house went on the market. So just with a group of people, that's really interesting. Here's some examples in a context you'll be familiar with. So a lot of us have been here, right? There's a whole bunch of people who want to release often because we want to do this really cool build, measure, learn thing. And we want to do that because we want our customers to love our products. At the same time, there's a whole bunch of people who want thorough, I meant to change this. This should be sort of long, testing takes a long time because we want production stability. And we want that because customers will love a product that's stable, that works. Yeah? And I've certainly been in a situation where we've had 2 camps who've been at each other about, you want to release often, that means we're not going to do this, and vice versa the other way. And as soon as you do this, you start thinking about, is this actually required? And that's where you can start shortcutting this to say, actually, you can have production stability and release often because we can do automated testing. Yeah? And that's where you can start aligning people, because you're aligning people against the common objective rather than against each other. Here's one final one. Here's one we've been grappling with at Skyscanner for a bit. So we're a data-driven company. We really like results. We really like that build, measure, learn feedback cycle. So we like metrics. So when we give people a goal, we give people some metrics, and we say, here's the metric that will tell you when you've met your goal. And that means people focus on metrics. And that means people measure results, and that has an impact on travelers. But we also want people to solve problems. And we found out that quite a lot of the times these two things become conflicting, that they stop doing this in favor of doing that. Yeah? And as soon as we drew this cloud, we realized that that didn't need to be in conflict, and we needed to work out how we could do these two things without that conflict existing. But drawing that made it really, really clear to us all. So that's just one tool from the toolbox. There's a whole bunch of other stuff out there. Like I said, it's 30 years' work of Ellie Goldratt, and there's a whole bunch of other people who've been writing stuff. The TOC community, I think, has a bit of a challenge. Unlike the Agile community, it hasn't been quite as prolific in the writing, the blogging. There's not as much stuff on Twitter, so it's harder to find. There's nowhere near as many books on TOC as there are on Agile, so it's harder to get your head around. So I hope that's given you a bit of an insight into one of the tools and some of the things to look at. Here's some links. Here's a whole pile of links. The systems stuff, if you're interested in systems, Chris did a really, really good talk at Lean Agile Scotland last year. Really, really recommend that. Really gives you a good idea about why that's important. And Clark's book, Rolling Rocks Downhill, gives you a really good understanding of how this works in the software industry, because he's essentially transposed all the goal stuff into a software environment. And we see the justification for some of the stuff we heard about earlier in some of the earlier talks. And this one at the top is the one that really blew my mind about defining what theory of constraints was. So that's a really good talk as well. If you've got feedback, I'd really like to hear it, because I'm giving this talk again at Lean Agile Scotland in a couple of weeks' time. So if you've got any feedback, please let me know. I'll tweet the link to these slides so you've got them for later on as well. Has anybody got any questions? Russell, do you want the mic?
Do I need the mic?
Yeah, come on. Shout in my general direction.
Someone's going to drop it afterwards.
Go, Russell.
Great talk. Great talk. You mentioned Clark's book.
Yeah.
And the goal. I think there might be another technique in theory of constraints, which might be the protagonists in these books are under incredible pressure.
Yeah.
And that's actually what drives them.
Yeah.
In the first place, right?
Yep.
So do these techniques work
When you're not under pressure.
when you're just turning up to work in the morning and trying the evaporating cloud technique?
Yeah.
Does it work then?
Yeah, I think so. So Goldratt actually says something really interesting, and I can't actually remember which of his books it is, but he says, analyze how you work in emergency, analyze how it happens, analyze what you do, what behaviors do you do, what things do you do when there's an emergency that you don't do the rest of the time, and then work out how to do that stuff the rest of the time, because that's the stuff that makes you really, really productive. As long as when you work out how to do it, you work out how to do it without burning yourself out. So because it works in an emergency, because it works when you're under pressure, this is also really, really good stuff to apply the rest of the time. You can use these things as retro formats. You can use these things just when you're talking to people. There was a chap at work 6-9 months ago who was umming and ahhing about should he stay in our commercial sales function, or should he become a product manager? And he and I scribbled an evaporating cloud to work that out. So we talked about the assumptions, and I just doodled that on my pad. You know, that's a really, really easy thing to do. Or you could use this really cool tool we're trying out at Skyscanner as well, if you've got sort of remote people too. But yeah, I think it does work day to day. And the Goldratt talks about a process of ongoing improvement. So this is something you should be he thinks you should be doing all the time. I think some of this stuff only gets rolled out when there is an emergency. And that's a bit sad, because you roll it out, you have a massive impact because you fix something, and then you don't do it again for a year, and then there's another big, and then you have to redo it all. So if you keep inspecting it, then it has a really good impact. Any other questions? I'm going to do the one at the front, and then we'll go to the back.
All right. Interesting. I took a leadership forum, and we were talking about the Socratic method. Mm-hmm. And I know old books, and I'd never put it together that it was a Socratic method he was using. And I love the Jonas character.
Yeah. It's him, right?
Yeah. Are you at Skyscanner? Are you becoming the Jonas character?
That's unfair to ask. You have to ask some other people.
No, so I have actually been myself at Clydesdale. Instead of telling people the answer, I've been spending more time getting them through the thinking of it.
But I think this does let you do that, right? Yeah. So it puts you in the so we were using current reality trees 3 or 4 months ago to solve big systemic problems. So there were a few projects at Skyscanner that hadn't delivered. So we sat down and we facilitated people through a current reality tree, and it took a while. It took 6 or 7 of us, 2 or 3 weeks of an hour, a couple of hours a day, locked in a room working through this stuff. So it can be pretty intense. But we facilitated through it, and they got to the answer themselves. Yeah. So one guy comes to one session. He sort of dropped in, and we got him in to validate this stuff. And he walked away with, and it was this one. And he walked away, and he thought, that's going to change everything I do in this business from this day onwards, because I understand about this dilemma. This dilemma is happening every day, and I need to change what I do, the direction I give, the teams I look after, all that kind of stuff changed. And that's not because I told him that. That's because he worked it out himself by seeing it in that logic. And that's what I think is a really visual tools that can really bring a team together. It's a nice agile thing. Is it's all whiteboards and sticky notes if you want to be, if you want it that way. There's one right at there. Run.
Thank you. This is really more a statement than a question, if I'm being honest. So when I first read the list of speakers and our chosen topics for this evening, I didn't know what theory of constraints was. No. So of course I did the automatic thing and went ahead and Googled it. And I guess the statement that I was planning to make is that you've really brought to life what can be quite a dry topic.
Thank you.
And you mentioned... No, I really do mean that as a compliment, because you mentioned earlier that it doesn't have the prominence of the Agile community. And I think the suggestion that I really want to make is if you want to read the profile letters, this is the exact sort of presentation that I would have liked to have seen or read about online, but obviously it's nice that I've seen it in person. So thank you for bringing it to life.
Cool, thank you. I think one of my motivations for doing this was 5 years ago, I Googled theory of constraints in a lunchtime and spent an hour looking at various pages and stuff and couldn't understand any of it and didn't get it. And I walked away, and 3 years went by until I finally got around to reading Clark's book, and then I got it. Yeah, and then I went on to read the goal, and then I started working at Skyscanner, where we do it all the time. But it's difficult. If you just Google it, I think there's a chance you'll go, oh, that's all about manufacturing, right? That's all about inventory levels and stock management and wastage on parts, and there's this Toyota thing, and yeah, and you won't. Connecting it with our industry is really tough. Cool, thank you.
I don't need that. Could you talk through that one like you did the Seaside one? This is really going to annoy me. I might be stupid.
Yeah. So this one's a little bit backwards, right? So we found that we were doing this. We found that we weren't doing that. Yeah. So it wasn't something where two groups of people came to the table and said, "Hey, I think we should focus on metrics," and another group of people said, "Hey, I think we should solve problems." That wasn't how this one came about. We came into them saying, we're focusing on metrics, but the thing we should be doing is solving problems. So therefore, there appears to be a conflict here. Why are we doing these things? What's that for? Okay, these two things both make sense. We need both these things. And in this situation, this is different from the Seaside one, right? Because in this situation, we make that go away. Yeah? Yeah? Whereas in the Seaside one, we made that one go away. So it doesn't have to be, it can be any of the arrows that you prove to be false. Yeah?
Can you take Liam Fox over this? Yeah. So like the rest of the theory of constraint stuff, once you understand it, you'll see them everywhere, right? Once you understand this stuff, right,
Once you understand this flow stuff and the constraint stuff, you will never stand on an escalator or stand in a coffee shop and not see a flow problem, right? This flow stuff, right, brought a London tube station that I have named, that I can't remember, I think it began with an H, if anybody can remember it, to its knees, right? Because they tried to get Londoners, I'm a Londoner, to stand on the left-hand side of the escalator. And anybody who's been to London, even as a tourist, knows how much of a travesty that is, right? The theory being that the escalator is the constraint, right? The escalator is our thinnest point of getting people out of the tube station in rush hour, right? And if people are walking up the escalator, there's 5 steps between them and the person walking. When if I'm standing, there's 2 steps between me and the person walking. Therefore, if everyone stands on the escalator 2 steps apart, we get more people up the escalator every minute, which means you get to work faster. You try convincing a whole bunch of Londoners of that at 8:30 in the morning. It didn't work. But that's exactly what's going on here. Yeah? Didn't help when The Guardian wrote up an article about it. Any other questions?
So I read the goal.
Okay.
So about the theory of constraints, when they identify the constraint and basically actually the constraint actually moves to something else. Mm-hmm. How do you detect when that happens? Carefully.
So, having in our environment, having metrics, having flow metrics in place helps a lot. So, if you're using something like Jira, you can just look at the back. You can look at the amount of stuff in backlogs as it goes up and down. You can look at flow rates and that kind of stuff. In a factory, it's really easy because you walk around, and if someone's got a shitload of inventory sat in front of their desk, that's where the constraint is, right? We don't quite have that luxury in this industry, so it works a bit differently. So we rely on looking at people's Scrum boards. One of the slides I don't have on here because it's on my longer deck is a Kanban board. So if you have a Kanban board and you've got that, and you've got a larger number of skills, if you've got an analyst in your team, if you've got a developer, and then you've got some testers, and you've got a ready for dev column and a ready for test column between your dev and test columns, and you find that there's always a whole pile of stuff in your ready for test column, then guess where your constraint is, right? So when you have your retrospective, if you tend any time in that retrospective talking about how to improve the development process, you're not going to have any impact because your constraint is in test. Yeah, vice versa. If it's in the ready for dev column, don't bother looking at how you can improve the test process because that's not where the constraint is. So yeah, I'm afraid a few metrics. Any other questions apart from when can we go to the pub? One more? No? Okay. Cool. Thank you very much.